The purpose here is not in any way to try to defend Craig Stephen Hicks or to try to justify the crime that he committed in February 2015. The purpose here is to expose the misrepresentation of the motive behind that crime, whereby irresponsible leftist media and irresponsible politicians hope to create propaganda for the suppression of white nationalism.
The House Judiciary Committee held a hearing today on hatred, white supremacy, and some of the terrible stuff we've been reading in the news lately. And there were a number of witnesses who testified about their experiences, both on the right and the left. But one of the most powerful parts of this hearing had to do with a man by the name of Dr. Mohammed Abu-Salha, whose 2 daughters and son-in-law were murdered because of hatred back in 2012. And so he goes into detail about what it was like to read the details of the autopsy reports. And I just want to warn you all that this is a difficult piece of testimony to listen to, but it was incredibly powerful. And I think it's important to know what's really going on in the country when it comes to white nationalists and the type of hate that our very own president stokes on a regular basis.
On the 9th of April 2019, Mohammed Abu-Salha gave testimony before the House Judiciary Committee hearing on hate crimes and the rise of white nationalism. Let us listen to these key moments pertaining to the motive of the murderer who killed his 2 daughters and son-in-law.
Dr. Abu-Salha.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, esteemed members of Congress, and ladies and gentlemen. February 10, 2015, that was the day our lives changed forever when my 2 daughters, Yusra and Razan, and my son-in-law Dia were shot to death execution style in Yusra and Dia's home in Chapel Hill. Trouble began when this man observed my 2 daughters appearing on the scene, adorned with their hijabs. I remember my Yusra telling me that this condescending man told her he hated how she looked and dressed. 3 beautiful young Americans were brutally murdered, and there's no question in our minds that this tragedy was born of bigotry and hate.
Dr. Abu-Salha says that he and his family are firmly convinced that Craig Stephen Hicks murdered his 2 daughters and son-in-law because of bigotry and hate. But the evidence for the murderer's motive that Dr. Abu-Salha offers is extremely thin. It is unverifiable hearsay from one of his daughters that Mr. Hicks had said that he hated the way she looked and dressed. It was a reasonable hypothesis that this triple murder might have been caused by anti-Muslim bias. However, in an article for the Occidental Observer that I wrote shortly after this crime occurred, I noted some strong indications that the murderer's motive was not racial. Yahoo News reported that Craig Stephen Hicks' Facebook page indicated that he was a fan of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Craig Stephen Hicks was a proponent of racial equality. Craig Stephen Hicks' motive for this crime was clearly not racial. I accepted the possibility, however, that Hicks was stoked to violence, possibly, by Zionist war on terror propaganda. There was widespread speculation that this crime had been meant as revenge for the killing of some Americans by ISIS, or for the Charlie Hebdo massacre that had occurred the previous month. There was a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric in Republican talk radio at the time, and one might think that perhaps this killing was motivated by some of that talk. That was a credible hypothesis, but it does not seem that Hicks had any particular dislike of Muslims.
Hicks's Facebook page did not appear to show him targeting Muslims. There were anti-religion posts. One reads, "Atheists for Equality." And in another post, he defends Muslims and criticizes Christians who were opposed to a planned mosque near Ground Zero, writing, quote, "Seems an overwhelming majority of Christians in this country feel that the Muslims are using the Ground Zero mosque plans to mark their conquest. Bunch of hypocrites."
And he doesn't seem like he was more vitriolic towards Muslims than he was towards Christians, or towards Islam more than Christianity. He really did not like the religions equally, from what I could see. Okay? So let's not jump to conclusions on that. And his views on religion otherwise looked fairly normal. They were normal atheist position that the religions aren't helping anyone. Well, that's true, right? And by the way, on his politics, clearly against Mitt Romney. If you, based on what he's put on social media, you'd put him definitely in the center left rather than the center right position. Almost no question about that, right?
The finding of the investigations by the local police and by the FBI was that these killings were the result of a running dispute over parking spaces.
The deaths may have been the result of an ongoing dispute over parking. One neighbor says Hicks had a reputation of being a hothead.
I have seen and heard him be very unfriendly to a lot of people in this community. Equal opportunity anger.
Another neighbor saying parking was an issue addressed by building management.
I'm assuming there was parking issues, so the I guess the condo association released this.
Karen Hicks is a suspect's wife.
I can say with my absolute belief that this incident had nothing to do with religion or victims' faith, but in fact was related to the long-standing parking disputes that my husband had with the neighbors.
Investigators have confiscated the suspect's computer, which was located in his apartment. They're trying to determine if he had any anti-Muslim leanings. A law enforcement source telling CNN the suspect told police he went into a blind rage after he saw a car allegedly belonging to one of the victims parked in his spot.
That is why Craig Stephen Hicks was charged only with first-degree murder and unlawful discharge of a firearm in a dwelling.
The person who committed this hate crime was Craig Hicks, and the Justice Department did look into this as a hate crime. Ultimately, he was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Again, they were shot and killed in their own home.
No hate crime charges were brought because there was not sufficient evidence to support such charges. This was Barack Obama's FBI and Barack Obama's Justice Department. If there had been a basis for bringing hate crime charges, you know that they would have done it. Okay, here's the summary. When these 3 young Muslims were murdered, their families, and apparently also many people on social media, jumped to the conclusion that it was an anti-Muslim hate crime. The local police and Barack Obama's Justice Department, however, investigated that possibility but were unable to substantiate it. Instead, the overwhelming preponderance of evidence indicated that the murders were the culmination of a long-running dispute and tensions over the illicit use of Craig Stephen Hicks' parking space. It was reasonable for those people on social media and for the families of the slain Muslims. It was reasonable for them to suppose that the killings represented anti-Muslim bias when they had no other evidence. But now that the FBI has investigated and found that it was not a case of anti-Muslim bias and not a hate crime, it becomes very unreasonable to insist that the uninformed guess of people on social media was correct and that the FBI is wrong. For some reason, Mohammed Abu-Salha prefers to believe, against the preponderance of evidence, that his daughters and son-in-law were victims of an anti-Muslim hate crime. Dr. Abu-Salha's delusion is forgivable. What is not forgivable is the pretense on the part of our crooked leftist politicians and crooked leftist media that Dr. Abu-Salha's story has something to do with hate crimes and white nationalism when it clearly does not. They are using his story in the effort to overwhelm people emotionally so that hasty and ill-considered measures for the suppression of white nationalism can be enacted. In that respect, the use of Dr. Abu-Salha's story is very much like the use of the tearful tale of Nurse Nayira before the war against Iraq in 1990.